Is Germany planning, in an unprecedented move, to repatriate its gold from U.S. vaults? Well, yes, that is becoming more and more possible, and it is absolutely shocking. Amid escalating tensions and economic turmoil, gold is suddenly back in the political spotlight, and of course, not by accident. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for being here. What we're seeing here is a much bigger argument about sovereignty, about power, and about how fragile the transatlantic US-EU relationship has truly become. I don't think that's a secret anymore. So let's start with the basic facts that most people don't really understand or know. Germany has the second largest gold reserves in the entire world, right after the United States. In total, those reserves are worth close to 450 billion euros. But only a little over half of that gold is actually inside Germany. About 37%, roughly 1,236 tons worth around 165 euros to 185 billion euros, depending on prices, is stored in the vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Another chunk actually sits in London, and a smaller portion is located in Paris. This setup made perfect sense during the Cold War. Germany was divided and very dependent on its Western allies for security. So naturally, keeping gold abroad ensured access to US dollars, to liquidity in global markets, and of course, it provided protection just in case Europe became a battleground again. Back then, no one questioned this setup. No one questioned this framework. But the world has changed, and that's why this issue is suddenly exploding into public and political debate. The immediate trigger is the growing tension between the European Union and the United States. Trade wars, tariffs, sanctions, and increasingly sharp political rhetoric have all chipped away at the assumption that Washington is a permanently stable and predictable partner. It's not. The world sees that now. It's not a reliable and predictable partner, and it has no intention to be one. Why is that, you might ask? Well, because Trump assumes that the United States is still the hegemon. As long as it projects power, economic power, military power, political power, the world will remain unipolar. But we know we've already crossed that bridge a long time ago. The world is no longer unipolar. It's fair to say that this open hostility toward alliances, the fixation on leverage, and Trump's willingness to weaponize economic tools makes Germany, and German elites in particular, ask a question they've avoided for decades. And the question is this: is it really safe to keep so much of our national wealth in someone else's vault? The answer, of course, is very obvious. But it may not be obvious to Germany at this point in time. Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, chair of the European Parliament's Committee on Security and Defense, openly called for Germany's gold to be brought back from the United States, and she urged the government to act fast. That alone tells you how much the political climate has shifted. This kind of statement would have been truly unthinkable in the mainstream not that long ago, even a year ago. Chancellor Friedrich Merz, on the other hand, chose his words very carefully. Surely he understands the logic, but pleasing Trump is the top priority, especially for a state that's become a vassal of the United States. So to that end, in the Bundestag, he said that as democracies, EU countries are, quote, partners and allies of the United States, not subordinates. Well, what else would you expect from Chancellor Merz? That is the kind of answer we should expect him to give. Then, of course, there's the Bundesbank, and that is a very interesting contradiction to the position of Chancellor Merz. Emmanuel Monch, who is a leading economist and former head of research at the Bundesbank itself, has publicly argued that keeping so much national wealth, so much gold, in the United States has become too risky. And his reasoning is very logical. He pointed to the fact that geopolitics have changed and that strategic dependence on Washington is no longer something Germany should be comfortable with. In his words, repatriating the gold would be a step toward greater strategic independence. That argument is spreading. Michael Jaeger, who is the head of the European Taxpayers Association, has gone even further. He openly questions whether Germany would even be able to access its gold in a serious political confrontation. And that is a very good question. In fact, that is an excellent question to ask at this point in time. Jaeger points to Trump's unpredictability, his obsession with extracting revenue anywhere possible, and even his provocative statements about seizing Greenland. So from that perspective, the gold isn't just sitting quietly in New York, in Manhattan. It is leverage. And frankly, I think that point is very valid. This is important because until recently, calls to bring the gold home mostly came from Alternative for Germany, the AfD. Their arguments were framed in nationalist and patriotic terms, which made it very easy for the mainstream to dismiss them. But that's no longer the case. The debate has crossed over, and now it's spreading in Germany. For example, Katharina Beck from the Greens has called the gold, quote, an anchor of stability and trust that must not become a pawn in geopolitical disputes. Even within Merz's own Christian Democratic camp, voices are growing louder and louder. And what I'm wondering about is this. Now that the EU has seized Russian assets, Euro 300 billion in Russian sovereign assets, and they understand that international law doesn't quite work in practice. Sure, it exists, but some are more equal than others. Now they know that anything may happen to them too. And the unpredictability of the Trump administration is definitely making them question whether they're just too vulnerable. Economists like Olivier Blanchard openly say the United States can no longer be treated as a fully reliable partner under the current administration. And at the same time, there is quite strong pushback, and we need to acknowledge that too. But I would argue that the shift in mentality in Germany has already begun. We see German gold repatriation being on the docket. It's being actively discussed, and is likely to continue being a central focal point as the US-EU escalations continue. Now, it's fair to argue that gold repatriation will not occur as long as Germany remains effectively a state with a large permanent presence of foreign troops, United States troops, and some call that occupation, similarly to Japan. So even if the German government does prefer to take that gold back home, which would be quite logical for it to do, it would be in its own interest to do so. But even if the German government, let's say a couple of years from now, does prefer to repatriate gold, it would be logical to assume that when Berlin formally raises the issue of withdrawing its gold from the United States, the answer would almost certainly be no. Not just from Washington, but also from within Europe itself. London and Paris, which also hold German gold, would likely interpret repatriation as a move toward greater German political autonomy, and too much of a shock. And that is not something they're too eager to encourage for a variety of reasons that are far beyond the scope of today's video. But we would be able to discuss them in future videos. If you're interested, just let me know in the comments below. This isn't really about gold, of course. It's not about gold bars stacked in a vault under Manhattan. That's not what it's about. This is about whether Europe, and Germany in particular, in this case, believes that it can afford to remain strategically dependent on a partner that is becoming more volatile, more transactional, and less predictable by the day. But the conversation has started, and that's what's really important. This is a major shift in public debate, and especially in German political elite circles. And once questions of sovereignty, of control, and of trust enter the mainstream, they likely won't disappear. Sooner or later, these issues resurface again at a much bigger scale. History repeats itself, after all, doesn't it? Let me expand on what this really means for the broader geopolitical landscape, because the implications of Germany, even considering gold repatriation, extend far beyond the physical movement of precious metal. What we're witnessing is a fundamental questioning of the post-World War II security architecture that has defined the Western alliance for nearly 8 decades. The entire premise of the transatlantic relationship was built on a simple bargain. The United States provides security and economic stability, while European nations align their strategic interests with Washington. This arrangement worked brilliantly during the Cold War, when the Soviet threat made the need for American protection crystal clear. European nations were willing to accept a certain degree of dependency because the alternative, facing the USSR alone, was unthinkable. But that world is gone. Russia, while still a concern, is not the existential threat it once was to Western Europe. China has emerged as a major economic partner for Germany, complicating the simple East-West binary. And most importantly, the United States itself has become unpredictable in ways that would have been unimaginable even a decade ago. The Trump administration's approach to alliances, viewing them primarily as transactional relationships where America deserves payment for its protection, has shattered the illusion of shared values and mutual commitment. When the American president publicly questions the value of NATO, threatens to withdraw from defense commitments unless allies pay up, and treats sovereign nations like business partners who need to renegotiate their contracts, it forces those nations to reconsider their fundamental assumptions. Gold repatriation is a perfect symbol of this reconsideration because it's both practical and deeply symbolic. On the practical level, having physical control over your gold reserves means you can access them in a crisis without needing permission from a foreign power. It means you can't be cut off from your own wealth if diplomatic relations sour. And given that the EU just froze 300 billion euros in Russian assets, setting a precedent that sovereign wealth can be seized for political reasons, German policymakers would be foolish not to consider whether the same could happen to them. But the symbolic dimension is equally important. Gold has always represented sovereignty and independence. For Germany to keep the majority of its gold reserves in New York, London, and Paris is to signal trust, interdependence, and acceptance of a certain hierarchical order. To bring it home would be to signal something very different: a desire for strategic autonomy, a hedging against American unreliability, and a willingness to prioritize German interests, even if that creates friction with traditional allies. This is why the reaction from London and Paris would be so significant. They hold German gold not just as custodians, but as partners in the Western alliance. If Germany retrieves that gold, it suggests that Germany no longer fully trusts the alliance structure. It suggests that Germany is preparing for a world where European unity might fracture, where the transatlantic bond might break, where each nation needs to look after its own interests first. The timing of this debate is also crucial. It's happening as Germany grapples with enormous economic challenges: a struggling industrial base, rising energy costs following the break with Russian gas, and increasing competition from China. The old German economic model, export-led manufacturing powered by cheap Russian energy and access to Chinese markets, is breaking down. Germany needs to find a new path forward, and that path might require more independence from Washington. There's also a generational dimension to this shift. The generation of German leaders who grew up during the Cold War, who viscerally remembered the Soviet threat and were genuinely grateful for American protection, is aging out of power. Younger politicians and voters have a different relationship with the United States. They see America as one partner among many, not as an indispensable protector. They're more willing to question arrangements that their predecessors took for granted. The Bundesbank economists and political figures now calling for gold repatriation are not fringe radicals. They're mainstream voices representing a genuine shift in German strategic thinking. When someone like Marie-Agnes Strack-Zimmermann, a centrist pro-European politician, calls for bringing the gold home, it signals that this is no longer a taboo topic relegated to nationalist politicians. It's entered the respectable mainstream debate. What makes this situation particularly delicate is that Germany is caught between multiple pressures. It needs the American security guarantee, especially with an aggressive Russia on Europe's doorstep. It needs access to American markets and technology. But it also needs to hedge against American unpredictability. It needs to maintain good relations with China for economic reasons while facing American pressure to decouple. It needs to show solidarity with European partners while also protecting its own interests. Gold repatriation becomes a way to signal autonomy without completely breaking with the alliance. It's a measured step toward independence, not a revolutionary break. Germany can bring its gold home while still remaining in NATO, still cooperating with the United States, still being a loyal European partner. But it would be a signal, a clear message that Germany is preparing for a more uncertain world where it can't take American reliability for granted. Whether this actually happens remains to be seen. The political and logistical obstacles are significant. But the mere fact that we're having this conversation, that mainstream German politicians and economists are openly discussing it, tells us something profound about where the Western alliance is headed. The certainties of the post-war order are dissolving. Nations are hedging. Trust is eroding. And symbols matter, perhaps now more than ever. The question isn't really whether Germany will repatriate its gold in the next year or two. The question is whether the underlying concerns driving this debate, concerns about American reliability, European sovereignty, and strategic independence, will continue to grow. And based on current trajectories, the answer seems to be yes. This conversation is just beginning, and it will shape European geopolitics for years to come. Thank you so much for watching Nuzik's Brief. I hope this video was interesting and that you learned something new from this update. If so, make sure you support my work, like, subscribe, and share. Thank you so much for your support. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you back here in the next update. Take care.